after all the presentations are done, we will start a discussion. So please, Maurice, go ahead. Your mic is still muted. Maurice, your mic is still muted. Sorry.
Yeah, now I was able to put my mic on. Sorry for that technical issue. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this fourth webinar on Science Policy Interface organized by Alternet, which is today dedicated to the subject, which is very hot topic in science and in society, the nature restoration law, which is under construction and which is to be voted on politically in the European Union. Today we want to challenge the question on scientific community, its challenges to help implementing this nature restoration law once it has been passed in the European Union. I myself, I am Maurice Hoffman, and I represent today the Alternet Network of Excellence, which is an association dating from 2004, which was raised as a network of excellence and still working. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary next year, and is primarily aimed at research underpinning policy making at the level of biodiversity, ecosystem services, and anything that is associated with those two topics. Alternet wishes to join the scientific community in addressing issues that are politically important and which they want to underpin with sound scientific knowledge and insight. I now hear myself. And that's why we organize this webinar today. Again, together with the Society of Ecological Restoration of Europe, the European part of it, which was that European part was initiated at my research institute in Brussels, and we are very happy to do this organization jointly with the SER-E, who will give also a short introduction on SER-E itself and on the nature restoration law. On the program today, we've got my introduction, then the introduction of Jorge Cortina, who's chairing the Society for Ecological Restoration in Europe, and he will welcome you in a couple of minutes. The core business of this webinar, though, is not Maurice and me, but of course the introduction of Carolina Beguña, Deputy Head of Natural Capital and Ecosystem Health Unit at the European Commission, with an introduction to the EC proposal of a nature restoration law, and that will be followed by a presentation of Chris de Cleer, who is very much working on this issue, and he is a senior researcher at INBO, at the Research Institute for Nature and Forest, and board member of SER-Europe. And he will address you on the challenges for the scientific community. We'll finish this webinar with a discussion which is moderated by Juliette Young of Alternet, and at the same time is affiliated to INRAE in France. For those who are not aware of Alternet as an organization, I do refer to the address that is above my head. Please consult that web address, and if you would ever consider as an institute to be a member of Alternet, feel welcome to join us through the website. there are some differences, quite some differences between Alternet and SER-Europe, and one of them is that Alternet is a network of institutes, not of persons. So it can only join as an institute. So consider, when you come from a scientific institute, to address your director or your management to consider membership of Alternet. SER-Europe, on the other hand, is rather an organization working with natural persons, but I'm sure that Jorge will give you more information on SER-Europe on short notice. Please remind, I'll finish this introduction with stating that Alternet on 2 occasions last year engaged itself with the declarations developed by SER-Europe as an input for the European Commission to further develop the nature restoration law, and we're quite happy to join the several people and organizations with undescribing the ideas that were given in the declaration by SER-Europe. Okay, thank you very much, and I'll now leave the floor to Jordi Cortina, just address or reminding you, please ask your questions in the chat, and we collect all the remarks until the end of the 3 presentations to address the different presenters of this in this webinar to answer your questions. So please give an indication if you think it is necessary to whom you are asking your question to in the chat. And Juliette Young will try to summarize and to work out the chats in particular questions. Thank you, and I'll give the floor now to Jordi, who will give you a presentation on SER-Europe. Jordi, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Maurice. I hope you can hear me now. I will share my screen. Oops. Can you see it now?
No.
I'm sorry. Okay. It's okay now, I think.
Yes, Jorge.
Okay, I'm sorry for this. Thanks again, Maurice, and thanks also INBO for hosting the seat of our society for many years. I'm Jordi Cortina. I'm the chair of the European chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration. Welcome everybody to this webinar, which is part of SER-Europe effort to support an ambitious European nature restoration law. We are a global organization with close to 5,000 members distributed across 5 continents and representing most ecosystem types. Our aim is to promote high-quality ecological restoration and thus bridge the gap between science, policy, and practice. In Europe, we are close to 500 members, and we are linked to national organizations in 8 countries, plus sister organizations as Eurosite. We are involved in a wide range of activities, from collating, analyzing, and synthesizing knowledge to facilitating networking and knowledge exchange. As membership fees are very low, to develop these activities, we use a diversity of funds, from public calls as Horizon Europe, Life, Erasmus Plus programs, to private funders, as well as our own resources. As examples that are relevant for the purpose of this webinar, we recently completed an Erasmus Plus project where we have assessed training needs for ecological restoration in Europe by means of surveys and focus group interviews in 4 countries and across Europe. Let me draw your attention to the widely recognized need to create networks of well-documented and certified demonstration sites, and the trainers concept that can be applied both at the secondary and vocational education and training education programs, and also for the education of experienced professionals. Also, the importance of platforms, particularly existing resource platforms, knowledge hubs, and extension services. We are convinced that standards of practice are crucial to guide practitioners, funding agencies, and policymakers, and make sure that ecological restoration projects deliver the benefits that they can provide. SER has developed general standards and sectorial standards, sometimes in collaboration with other organizations like WWF Spain and organizations contributing to the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. SER-Europe is involved in many other activities as conferences, courses, webinars, and Make a Difference Week, a coordinated effort to develop restorative actions globally. Our efforts in the Science-Policy Interface are obviously focused now on the nature restoration law. We thank Alternet and other organizations for supporting the declaration for an ambitious European law. We are fully aware that the proposal for a new regulation must be improved, that's no doubt, but we also consider that this is a unique opportunity that we cannot afford to miss. Very briefly, let me mention some reasons for supporting the law and thus respond to challenges of the global environmental crisis. First of all, the rate of ecological restoration in Europe is currently uncertain. We don't know how much restoration is being performed, and probably it's order of magnitude lower than needed. Ecological restoration policy has been so far a collateral effect of other EU policies. So there's actually no ecological restoration policy in Europe. And the lack of planning and maintenance have contributed to major environmental problems, like massive forest dieback, wildfires, or the sustainability of forest plantations performed under the Common Agricultural Policy. We should also take into account that ecological restoration is not a cost, but an investment. The 140 billion euros needed for the implementation of this law can be compared to the estimated annual cost of 38 billion of land degradation. That's an estimation made by Luca Montanarella some years ago. So we are talking about a yearly investment for each European citizen of close to 12 euros. Finally, we support this law because we know that barriers for ecological restoration in Europe are first related to socioeconomics and governance, and largely related to political commitment. That's why we co-organize this webinar, and we are developing a wide range of activities to support this proposal that I won't go into detail. I must mention that this presentation is being recorded and it will be freely available once the webinar is finished. I wanted also to mention that we are working at the member state level. So we have recently assisted the Spanish government in a large effort to develop guidelines and criteria for ecological restoration in Spain, an effort that involved close to 100 experts from multiple disciplines. So thank you very much for your attention. Please help us promote high-quality ecological restoration in Europe and globally. And I'm really looking forward to a productive webinar and to your inputs. So back to you, Maurice.
Thank you, Jorge, for the clear presentation and the clear goals as well of SER-Europe as far as the nature restoration law is concerned. And we are quite happy with this type of cooperation, and we should elaborate it to the future, I think. I think some ideas will be posed on that one by Chris de Cleer, who will be the last presenter today. Allow me to give the floor now to Carolina de Cunha, the Deputy Head of Natural Capital and Ecosystem Health Unit at the European Commission, with her introduction to the EC's proposal of a nature restoration law. I hope, Carolina, that you will be able to share your presentation with us.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see my presentation. It's not yet. Yeah, I think you can see it now.
It's perfectly doable.
Very good. So yes, I will. It's really a pleasure to be here with you and present this proposal that we have adopted last year in June. I'll try to do that quickly, maybe skipping some of the slides. But we can also you can also take a look at the presentation. I suppose it will be shared with all the participants. So just to give you a little bit of the background why the EU has proposed this law. Of course, you're all very familiar with the big problem of biodiversity loss and the poor state of biodiversity and nature globally. With this recent, now maybe not so recent anymore, report of IPBES, the global assessment in 2019, the new commission decided to act decisively on this issue. I will come back to that in a minute. And that also was triggered by the poor state of European nature. So, of course, we can in Europe act in Europe. We try to act globally, but the competence, the laws that we have are here in Europe. So, so for that we have prepared this proposal. We look at the state of nature in our reports and regularly monitor what the situation is like, and it's been continuously deteriorating as everywhere in the world, unfortunately as well. So the data from 2018 show that over 80% of the assessments of EU protected habitats listed under the Habitats Directive are in unfavorable status. So it's either bad or poor status. And that's compared to 77% in 2013. So there was a decrease of the condition of those habitats. And of those habitats, 36% deteriorated, only 9% improved. So clearly there is a negative tendency. And that is for habitats that are covered by legislation on nature protection. So of course, what is going on outside of these habitats is even worse, presumably. So we are basically approaching a situation where ecosystems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt to external pressures. So protecting nature, protecting biodiversity is important, but it is no longer enough. And that's very clearly demonstrated by our assessments. So it's really time to increase and accelerate restoration to repair the damage that has been done, both within the protected areas, but also everywhere else. And we must do that not exclusively for the sake of nature. It's also for us, for the possibility to keep benefiting from these enormous ecosystem services that nature provides. So that's why the EU and this commission in particular was very dedicated to scaling up the implementation of restoration, nature-based solutions, etc. So the key point here in this consideration is also the timing, and the timing is very short. That also goes in parallel to the urgency to act on climate. And the IPCC report in 2022 very clearly stated that we only have a very brief and also rapidly closing window to secure a livable future for us. So we really basically have to act now, and restoring ecosystems is fundamental also to help us combat climate change and to reduce our risks to food security. Food security is, of course, threatened mostly by the destruction of nature and climate change. Also, the World Economic Forum's annual global risk report. The World Economic Forum, you might be familiar with their global risk reports. They issue them annually, and they have a sort of a ranking of global risks. What are the biggest global risks to humanity, to the planet? And unfortunately, biodiversity went up in the ranking of those risks, and now is in the infamous top 3. Including climate change as well. So all big reports, all big institutions come to the same conclusion that we have to act very urgently to stop this from happening. I have mentioned that this Commission was very ambitious on biodiversity. Indeed, that's quite a change compared to previous colleges, but also the severity of the situation is unfortunately not leaves us no other option. So under the European Green Deal that this college has adopted, there was a chapter on protecting and restoring nature, and there the Commission promised that it will produce a new law on nature restoration, and as a result, the nature restoration law was adopted in June 2022. This law was also mentioned in the biodiversity strategy, and as I said, in the strategy we have concluded that protection is not enough, that the voluntary targets that we had under the previous strategies for nature protection and for nature restoration were not met. So we needed a binding, reinforced approach, and therefore the nature restoration law was adopted by the college. The considerations behind this law, this legal proposal, just to mention very briefly, were the following. First of all, we wanted to go for a legal form of a regulation. You might know that we adopt different types of legal acts in the EU. Directives and regulations are the main ones. The difference is that a directive needs to be transposed by all 27 member states into their national laws. So they will have 27 different national laws on restoration if we chose this form. We have decided that with this urgency to act, we need to have a regulation which applies immediately. But of course, it has the constraint that it has to be very, very precise because of this directive act to those who are addressed. We wanted to complement and build on the existing policy framework, so not to revamp everything, but to build really on, in particular, the birds and habitats directives. We have built in synergies between climate change and nature that's very strongly incorporated in the law, and we needed a very large-scale restoration effort. So in principle, we have to address all ecosystems. And therefore, the targets that we opted for are a bit of a mixture of area-based targets, but also indicator-based targets, and I will come to that in a minute. So first of all, what is nature restoration? I don't think I need to talk about that here in this forum, but just to recall very briefly what the definition of restoration that we used is. It's a process of actively or passively assisting the recovery of an ecosystem towards good condition. So the important elements are that it's either active or passive form of restoration, and the achieved result should be to improve, to re-establish, to reconnect ecosystems, habitat types, or habitats of species. I have here some examples that we sometimes show to stakeholders from live projects that implemented restoration measures. So you can see here, for instance, a photograph from 2004. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the same area in 2020, where restoration measures were implemented. And then just as an example of what we mean is another type of restoration, and that is introducing landscape features in agricultural areas, where you have two types of agricultural landscapes, one without any practically landscape features and one with quite a lot of landscape features. So these are types of restoration measures that we are aiming at. Now, moving on to the structure of the new regulation, it has one overarching objective, that is to restore 20% of ecosystems by 2030, and all ecosystems in need of restoration by 2050. I'll come back to that in a minute. Then we have a number of specific ecosystem dedicated targets, and finally we have provisions on how to go about it. So measures on implementation. So what member states have to produce, reports, national restoration plans, how the monitoring should be done, etc. I'll go through those rather quickly, but if there are any more detailed questions, I will be happy to try to answer. So these overarching objectives I have already mentioned. This objective is for the EU as a whole, so it's not per individual member state. Restoration measures have to cover 20% of EU land and sea by 2030, and by 2050 all ecosystems in need of restorations. And then there are a number of specific restoration targets, quite different ones for different types of ecosystems. So moving on to these more specific ecosystem targets. First of all, we have, as I said, a number of objectives related to the existing legislation. So we build on the Habitats and Birds directives. And there we ask member states to put in place restoration measures. So it really is an objective for them to start restoring, to put measures on restoration in place in order to achieve certain objectives that are specified in the law. So for habitat types that are covered by current legislation, they have to improve their condition by a certain percentage, by a certain year, or re-establish habitats that are no longer there, again, by a certain percentage, by a certain year. Then there are requirements for habitats of species to improve their quality and quantity, or to reconnect those habitats. And then we also have outcome-based objectives, which are a continuous improvement in areas subject to restoration measures, so that there is no deterioration after the good condition has been reached. The famous non-deterioration principle, with certain exceptions for force majeure, etc. And then 90% of habitat area has to be in good condition, and there's a reference to favorable reference area. And finally, increasing trend needs to be maintained towards the sufficient quality and quantity of habitats and of habitats of species. So these are very specifically linked to the existing legislation and strengthen the implementation of this legislation because it is not properly implemented today. And then we have targets for specific ecosystems. So first of all, I have here target for urban ecosystems, where we propose to ensure a steady increase in urban green space. And also in tree canopy cover in densely populated areas from the adoption of or entry into force of the regulation to 2050. And this can be achieved by greening urban planning processes over time, restoring degraded industrial land, increasing green roofs, tree lining streets, creating micro parks, allotments, even by greening car parks. There is various different measures for greening urban areas. So there you see that there are specific targets of no net loss of green space by 2030, increase by a percentage in the total national area of urban green space. So again, it's on the national level, not in each city. But then there are also targets per city, so minimum of 10% tree canopy cover by 2050, and net gain of urban green space integrated into buildings and infrastructure developments. Moving on to other types of ecosystems on rivers, we propose a target which is very closely linked to a political, non-legally binding target that is included in the biodiversity strategy, and that is to achieve 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers in the EU by 2030. So basically, the provisions of the law oblige member states to identify and then to remove barriers that prevent the connectivity of rivers, of surface waters, to contribute to that political target of 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers, and also the targets for riverine habitats and ecosystems that are already also in the legislation. So, for instance, that's the re-establishment of floodplains. Then we have specific targets on pollinator populations, where we ask member states to reverse the decline of pollinator populations by 2030, and for that we will ask them to monitor pollinator populations in a standardized way, or harmonized way rather, until satisfactory levels are reached. There has to be a methodology for annual monitoring established, and we are working on that methodology, so that target will be then linked to other probably implementing acts which will establish that methodology to monitor populations of pollinators. On agricultural ecosystems, there's quite a few different targets. Again, member states are asked to put in place restoration measures to enhance biodiversity of those ecosystems. In addition to those measures that I mentioned already for agricultural ecosystems that are under the Habitats Directive and Birds Directive. So what we ask member states to do is to achieve an increasing trend in certain indicators. And we have proposed 3 indicators listed here: grassland butterfly index, stock of organic carbon in cropland mineral soils, and share of agricultural land with high diversity landscape features. So that's that picture that I showed before. And this increasing trend has to be achieved until satisfactory levels are achieved. There are specific targets to enhance the farmland bird index by 2030, 2040, and 2050, and that has to be done at national level. And there is a very specific target on drained peatlands under agricultural use, for which we set we ask member states to put in place restoration measures to re-wet those peatlands. This is a very important target for climate, and therefore very important also for our commissioner and the college. There are certain flexibility clauses that allow member states that have a lot of these drained peatlands to re-wet, to make it a little bit easier for them. So there is certain flexibility built into this target. However, of course, this target is raising quite a lot of discussions, as you can imagine, in member states that are using this organic land, organic soils for agriculture. Then we have targets on forests. Their forestry practices in some areas will basically need to be adapted so that larger areas of forests approach a semi-natural or natural state. So the idea is that there's lower logging intensity and more close to nature forestry. But of course, restoration does not necessarily mean that there's no use of forests. It just have to be used in a different way. So there, for forests, we again propose that member states achieve a certain level, satisfactory level, for a number of indicators. And they have to basically show an increasing trend until the satisfactory level is achieved. And we proposed the indicators listed in this slide. So standing and lying deadwood, share of forest with uneven age structure, forest connectivity, common forest bird index, and again, stock of organic carbon. There, of course, there's a lot of discussion on whether other indicators should be used, both within the Parliament and the Council. So we will have to see how this article evolves. And now moving on to this implementation framework, the main tool to deliver on this will be the nature restoration plans. They will have to be adopted by member states and then sent to the Commission, presented to the Commission. Member states will have to ensure that they're consulted and that there's appropriate involvement of both civil society and the relevant stakeholders in their preparation. It is really for the member states then to say what will be restored, where, and how. They will have to do that preparatory work based on monitoring, on research, on science, because member states know the state of their nature. We don't know it for them, and they will have to basically decide what is most urgent and what has to be done where and for how much, because the impacts will be very local very often. Member states will also have to decide how to restore, so they will have to plan restoration measures, again, by each target for each ecosystem. They need to specify how to finance restoration, whether by using European funding, but also national or public and private funding. Member states will also have to look into links to other land and sea use activities, and that will be very important and probably quite difficult then to reconcile. They will have to see how restoration can be linked to the deployment of renewable energies. They will have to look at so-called go-to areas, so areas that are destined for the deployment of renewables. They'll have to look where are most co-benefits for climate change mitigation and adaptation, and these areas will probably be the #1 targets for restoration. And as I said, public and stakeholder participation in the preparation of the plans will be instrumental. So these plans will be sent to the Commission. As I said, we will issue opinions, comments on those plans, but we will not be approving them. Member states will have to take those comments into account and then publish their plans afterwards, after revision, following the comments from the Commission. Another very important part that I would like to mention, and I'm now nearing the end of my presentation, is the implementation, is the monitoring and reporting framework. Member states will have to monitor the state of their ecosystems, and they have to report on the implementation of restoration measures and on the results that they achieved. We will work closely with the European Environment Agency on that. It's a very big task, so we will quite heavily rely on their expertise. And then the European Environment Agency will help us to assess progress in implementing of these targets and obligations. I will maybe skip the slide on financing of restoration that has already been touched upon briefly, but indeed restoration will not be very cheap. But if we don't restore, the price to pay will be much higher. And of course, restoration brings enormous benefits in terms of ecosystem services. Of course, the problem is how these benefits are then distributed. We all benefit from restoration measures, but then the cost is often the cost of restoration is often borne by a small group of stakeholders, such as forest owners, for instance. So there is a need to see how these landowners, where nature restoration will take place, can be remunerated or compensated. How can we bring them on board to start restoration as soon as possible? And the last slide is a little snapshot on where we are now with this regulation. Actually, it's going very fast, I have to say. I was a little bit afraid that perhaps the Council will not be moving fast enough on this, because there is controversy about this law. But it is a very good pace. The Czech presidency last year had 10 council meetings on this law, so they went through the text twice. The Swedish presidency has now very recently produced the first revised draft of the law with proposed amendments. And they aim to reach a so-called general approach, which is an agreement between the 27 member states on the revised text in June. So that will be voted in Council in June, most likely in Strasbourg. Possible adoption of the whole law together with the Parliament is scheduled for 2024, so for next year, before the parliamentary elections and before the end of this college, which is somewhere around mid-2024. So there's not much time left. The Parliament was a little bit behind member states, but now accelerated quite a lot. The leading committee is the Environment Committee in the Parliament, but because of implications for agriculture, for fisheries, for forestry, there are also these two other committees in the European Parliament, Agri and PESH, associated for certain articles and paragraphs. So all these committees in the Parliament produce their own reports. The ENVI committee was very positive, trying to increase ambition. But of course, the agricultural and the fisheries committees were a little bit more skeptical and concerned about the costs and the impacts on economic operators. That final report vote on the final parliamentary position is also scheduled for June or July in the Parliament, and then once the Council and the Parliament have their two positions, after the summer we will start so-called trialogues. These are meetings between the Parliament, the Council and the Commission, where all the three positions are discussed and we try to reach a compromise. So these will start from September. We will defend our proposal, but we already see that we will have to move a little bit here or there. And of course, there will be different positions to reconcile on this. Very much counting on your support in this process, I have to say, because science is really underpinning this nature restoration project. We are constantly being asked about scientific evidence, cost benefits, etc., etc. So it is very important to have really live examples from projects that we could use, that we could quote, that show the benefits and that show, and this is very, very important, the risks of inaction. So my plea to you would be also to try to support this process wherever you can, and through whatever channels are accessible to you. And now I will finish my presentation with just some links, and I will stop sharing the screen. I also have to say that I saw there was probably some activity in the chat, but I was not able to follow, so I will maybe try to catch up during the last presentation. Chris, I think the floor is it's over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolina.
Before I give the floor to Chris, just an in-between. Thank you very much, Carolina, by the way. Anyone who is in the audience, please use the emoji, and you are doing now very good. For your appreciation for Carolina's presentation, which was very clear and transparent, I think. One question to Jordi and to Carolina. Just look at the chat now and try, if you are able to, get short answers to questions that have been risen in the chat, because I think if you don't, then Juliette will have an awful job to summarize all the chat questions that are growing. So please look into those already if you can. Okay, that leaves me with inviting Chris de Cleer to take the floor on his contribution to this webinar, sorry, on challenges for the scientific community, exactly the target group that we are organizing this webinar for in the first place. Chris, I think indeed your presentation is on the screen and you can start your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Maurice, and good afternoon, everybody. Happy to see there is so much interest for this webinar. First, an apology. You will hear a beep once in a while. That's I cannot do anything about it. Anytime that a person joins the webinar, you will hear this beep, and I cannot find the way to put it off. So apologies for that. So first of all, yes, from what Carolina already mentioned, there is some controversy about this law, and we hear some criticism. The law is too ambitious. Member states have no capacity. It's a waste of money. It will create a loss of jobs, a loss of food security, etc. And I think as scientists working in the field of sustainable use of the natural environment and working in nature conservation and restoration, I believe we have, as a community, kind of moral duty, I would say, here to show policymakers that quite the opposite is true. and that we are there to support them in the transformative change we need to adequately tackle the biodiversity and climate crisis. So I will briefly introduce to you a few of the main challenges that we face as a scientific community. So as you heard from Carolina, member states have to submit a national restoration plan to the Commission, specifying where, when, how the provisions of the nature restoration law will be achieved. And importantly, member states only have 2 years to do that. And so that's a big challenge. So this is what the law says specifically for our scientific community. Member states shall prepare the national restoration plans and carry out all preparatory monitoring and research needed to identify restoration measures necessary to meet the targets in the Articles 4 to 10, and therefore take into account the latest scientific evidence. One small comment from my side is that I would add there as well the scientific expertise, because it can perhaps be legally disputed if expert judgment classifies as scientific evidence. And of course, if we only have 2 years to draft these plans, we need to avoid years of delay or even court cases on discussion on the word of evidence. So I start my overview with the provisions on the habitats as stated in Article 4 and 5. 4 being the terrestrial, coastal and freshwater habitats, and 5 the marine habitats. And we will need to quantify the area for restoration based on the distribution of habitats both inside and outside Natura 2000. And we need to identify the areas that are currently not in good condition. So habitats not in good condition will need to be restored to good condition, meaning a state where physical, chemical, compositional, so including the typical species, but also the structural and functional state and the landscape and seascape characteristics are all taken into account, and that they reflect the high level of ecological integrity, stability, and resilience necessary to ensure its long-term maintenance. So a lot of criteria here to think about how we will define a good condition for all the habitat types. Some member states or politicians criticize the fact that we should also consider restoration outside the Natura 2000 network. For me, I think scientifically it makes perfect sense when you realize that no less than 66% of the non-marine habitats are actually situated outside Natura 2000. And so we can never achieve a good condition or favorable conservation status for habitats by only looking at conservation and restoration within the Natura 2000 network. Secondly, if the area is not large enough to sustainably achieve a good condition, member states should identify areas where there is good potential for the re-establishment of the habitat type. And here the term favorable reference area is really crucial. This will define, in my opinion, the whole ambition level of the National Restoration Plan. And favorable reference area is defined as the minimum necessary total area at national level to ensure long-term viability of the habitat type and its species and all its significant ecological variations within its natural range. So the favorable reference area includes both existing areas where the habitat already occurs, but it should also include areas where the habitat need to be re-established, where it has been degraded to a large extent or even has been lost in recent times. So this is further specified in Article 11.2.8 that we should take into account for defining favorable reference area that the area is large enough to cope with the predicted changes to environmental conditions due to climate change, and that we take into account also, as I mentioned, the losses over the past years. And in the proposal, they mentioned 70 years. 70 years for me makes sense because it coincides with the end of the Second World War, which is really a pivotal period where we see the shift towards more intensive agriculture. We also see the development of reports on nature conservation and monitoring results. We see good air photography that becomes available to help mapping the existence of areas that were there once, but that we now have lost. Also, land abandonment becomes an issue in many semi-natural habitats. So maybe in the law, as a proposal, I would also see fit to include there that any other science-based reference period or data can be considered to help defining the favorable reference area, because there's always exceptions, and that for a particular region in Europe or in a particular habitat type, this 70 years is not a suitable metric to consider. So just to show what we did in Flanders, for instance, we made an analysis that since the Second World War, Flanders lost no less than 75% of its wetlands. And we know the presence of the different types of wetlands that were there shortly after the Second World War by the availability of detailed maps that we translated into this occurrence of habitat types, and then we can of wetland habitat types, and then we can analyze to what extent these can still be restored. So when they are not being urbanized yet, but just intensification of agriculture, often there is good opportunity, and we know from practice that there is a fair chance that there is a possibility to restore these wetlands. So these maps, of course, are the perfect tools to help us in considering how to define these favorable reference areas. So the next step, of course, is then to identify the restoration measures for all the sites with existing habitats that are not in good condition or that need to be re-established. Again, it should be based on the best available knowledge, something that we should come up with. So the timing is that the areas that are not in good condition should be, well, let me start again. So it's important that the areas that are not good condition become in good condition, but we know that it takes a long time, depending on the habitat type, depending on the circumstances locally, that it can take a long time before we reach that point. So that's why the target in the nature restoration law is put at measures in place, and restoration is a process that of constant, continuous improvement, and it should be taken into account. So it's the measures in place that count, not the fact that the habitat is already in good condition or not. And also important to know is that the target deals with the measures in place per habitat group, and of course, that also makes sense, as it is often difficult to predict where exactly individual habitat types will reestablish or evolve when you are working at the landscape level or over a long period of time. And of course, the provisions of the Habitat Directive remain in force, that is still an obligation for member states to establish a good conservation status at the level of the individual habitat type. So, and finally, the nature restoration plans need to specify which non-deterioration measures need to be taken. Of course, investments in nature restoration should be effective and sustainable. It's a waste of money if we allow deterioration after spending money on restoration. So, and there is also as an inspiration for member states and avoid greenwashing, an Annex 7 added to the nature restoration law with a list of examples of typical nature restoration measures to pick from. So in short, just to give you the brief picture of the big challenge that we face is that for all the habitats in any member state country or habitat groups, we need to map their occurrence within Natura 2000, outside Natura 2000. We need to identify the sites that are not in good condition or the sites where the condition is still unknown, because the Commission considers them to be part of the area to be restored if the area is in unknown condition. So then we have the challenge to define the favorable reference area. So the areas which are heavily degraded or that have been lost in the past, but still have good potential for restoration and enlarging the areas. Then we need to look at better connectivity. We know from the Habitats Directive, Article 10 is a rather weak article in the Habitats Directive. In the Nature Restoration Law proposal, this is more prominent now, an obligation for the member states to really look at how we could achieve better connectivity and building ecological corridors to, in the end, reach a robust, resilient network of ecosystems in good condition, and that also follow this landscape approach. This is in yellow something that I added personally here because I think it's missing a little bit in the law. It's namely the necessity for designation of buffer zones where negative pressures need to be tackled. Eutrophication, drainage, also the impact of climate change may need the availability of buffer zones, other disturbances, of course. So I think it's recommendable to identify in the national restoration plans also buffering measures as part of the Article 9 and 10 obligations, so the obligations on restoration of agriculture and forestry areas, so that they can also be included later on in the strategic planning under the Common Agriculture Policy, for instance. And so, but in the whole planning and the whole design of the restoration that we need to do, I think this buffering is an essential plays an essential part. Okay, so then we come to the habitats of the bird and habitat directive species, and the Nature Restoration Law obliges member states to quantify the area for restoration based on the distribution of habitats of the species, both inside and outside Natura 2000. Also look at the connectivity that is needed, on re-establishment of habitats of species that is needed, and anticipate on possible impacts of climate change. So further, the member states need to identify the necessary restoration measures for existing habitats and habitats to be re-established. And contrary to the habitats, there is no exact timeline here as an obligation. The law only mentions that we need an increasing trend towards sufficient quality and quantity of the habitat of the species in order them to achieve a favorable conservation status. Why is that? The reason behind this is that the European Environmental Agency could not provide, or from the reporting of under Article 17 in the Habitat Directive, we have no data, in fact, where those habitats of species are situated exactly in the member states. So, and for the definition of what is quality and quantity of the habitat of a species, well, it should be the quality and quantity that allows the ecological requirements of a species to be met at any stage of its biological cycle, so that it is maintaining itself on a long-term basis as a viable component of its habitat in its natural range. So I will be more brief on the other provisions that need to be included in the national restoration plans. On agriculture, we need to map the areas for enhancing biodiversity. So in addition to the potential areas in agriculture use under Article 4 and 5. So outside those areas, we also need to allocate areas where we take measures and add a timing for improvement of status for common farmland birds, the rewetting of drained peatlands, and there are time-bound targets for them as well, and also areas for enhancing connectivity. And so also mentioned already in Article 4. And furthermore, we need measures to enhance biodiversity overall in the agriculture landscape. And the main indicator there for monitoring and reporting that will be used is the grassland butterfly index. Also in the agriculture croplands, carbon stocks need to increase, and we need to define also ambitions at member state level for the share of high diversity landscape elements. And on a scientific basis, the indicators with asterisks, it's up to us a little bit to propose what do we consider to be a satisfactory level for these indicators. And then the provision in the laws only mentions that member states have to show a continuous increasing trend and quality for these indicators. Also, a proposal from myself with the question mark is if we are not overlooking here also the importance of reducing the pressures from the agriculture landscapes to the nature core areas, and so the nature areas where nature is the primary function. So I would recommend also try to include measures on that aspect in these parts of the national restoration plans. Same for the forestry landscapes outside the Article 4 and 5, Article 4 areas. So we need to map areas for enhancing biodiversity, identify measures and a timing for improvement. Focus will be on status for common forest birds. That's the indicator that needs to be monitored, and areas for enhanced connectivity. And besides that, within those forest landscapes, for climate reasons, we need to improve the share of standing and lying deadwood, share of uneven age structure, and stock of our organic carbon overall. And with an asterisk, it's up to us to define what should be the satisfactory level in those forestry landscapes. And then after implementation of the law, member states should show that there is an increasing trend in for all these indicators. Again, importance of reduction of pressures and buffer zones. You can imagine that can be very important around the old growth forest relics that we still have in Europe, to buffer them with near natural forests, so to say, or where there may be not necessarily a non-intervention management, but where there is taken to account that we want to build these great, robust areas. Okay, very short on river barriers. We need to map them, where they are, where are the obsolete ones that we can remove, where are the embankments in the landscape, maybe that we can do measures for improving or reestablishing natural floodplain functioning, also in taking into account, of course, the presence of habitat types that may be there that are maybe in contradiction with a floodplain functioning. So this should be a balance. It should be careful consideration in the National Restoration Plan, where to do this and where not. And of course, we need to identify a timing for all these measures. And as was mentioned by the speaker before me, the result should be 25,000 kilometers of free-flowing rivers by 2030. Pollinators, more or less the same. Define measures for the reverse decline of pollinator populations, put forward a timing. There's a lot of ideas already on practical actions that member states can take in the policy brief that was presented with the revision of the EU pollinators initiative under the biodiversity strategy 2030. And then member states, when implementing the National Restoration Law, they will need to show reversing decline by 2030 and an increasing trend after 2030. Okay, and then it was not mentioned as such yet, but I think very, very important is that we do our uttermost best to illustrate to the policymakers that nature restoration has the ability to provide a lot of synergies in climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, and disaster prevention, and also in perhaps less accepted now, but we should take that more into account, I think, where find ways how renewable go-to areas can coincide or can coexist with nature restoration. And so restoration measures also need to minimize the climate change impacts on nature. So it's also working the opposite direction, minimizing we should also consider in the measures we take for nature areas how to minimize the impact of climate change. As Carolina mentioned, there will be stakeholder participation. The law mentions that we need to optimize ecological, economic, and social functions of ecosystems. There needs to be a clear contribution to sustainable development. There need to be financial support to the affected stakeholders, and we need to identify adverse subsidies with the intention, I hope, to phase them out. So I think we will need the help here of colleagues from social science and also legal experts to work on this. And of course, we need to avoid that public participation results in a watering down of the ambition level at the end, or a delay in taking action on the ground. There is a lot of information that we need when we go to the implementation phase, and I see a lot of work to do for the scientific community. We need to define the baseline situation, abiotic and biotic conditions, the pressures that are there that need to be tackled. What is the ecological potential? Are there any socioeconomic opportunities around the barriers for restoration to be considered? Finally, formulate a vision for the area and what are the concrete ecological targets, then defining the cost-effective restoration measures and what kind of measures shall we take to avoid deterioration of the areas that we restore. Then we have to take the socio-economic measures and financial support as part of that into account, and the legal support we will need to make it happen on the ground. We need then identify the indicators for monitoring in each restoration project. There need to be at least some basic reporting on where we are in the restoration process, and there may be a necessity also to implement adaptive management measures. Oops, what was that? Sorry. Where was I? Yes, here. Okay, so then I nearly come to a closing with a proposal on how I think we should have a better governance for the challenge that we face as a scientific community. So I think my conviction that we should try to establish at national level first these knowledge network hubs, where all the thematic expert teams can come together and discuss all the items that have been presented that need to be part of these national restoration plans. And of course, these expert teams, they need to be supported. There need to be some financial support. There need to be a national secretariat for overall coordination. And so just a non-exhaustive list of what these networks could do is basically, first of all, for the science-based support for the national restoration plan, is identifying where the priority areas are for restoration, how they define this very complex and difficult item of what do we consider to be the favorable reference area, also make the connection with ecological network objectives under the biodiversity strategy, so the 10% strictly protected and 30% protected area. So how should we consider cross-ecosystem coordination, and always at landscape approach, and then also formulate what are the main gaps in our knowledge, so that we can also formulate priority research actions from these expert teams. Then at the level of the site restoration plans that we need, and so what is for this site the good condition, what needs to be changed in terms of soil, in terms of hydrology, how is the condition of the typical species, what can be improved in terms of connectivity, etc. What are, in this particular case, the best measures that we can take or should promote. And then, of course, there's all this support that will be needed for site assessments, studies, and follow-up of the implementation of restoration. And then there is also the training that will be needed for the site managers. Some are already very advanced, some are really novice people. So we need to organize field trips, workshops, symposia. We can establish a documentation platform at the national level with best practice guidance. And that, I think, is very important, because it's very often underestimated. And people say, oh, we have this international knowledge depositories already, but that is all in English, and a lot of site managers never go to these websites or to this information to learn what to do. And so this is very important that we do the training and make the documentation availability better for the novice, especially for the novice site managers and private landowners and so on. And then last but not least, the monitoring and reporting that we need. And we need to have our national database on restoration and register of all the actions that have been taken, the coordination that will be necessary also for how we do the monitoring, how do we assemble the data, the reporting from that, and also producing from those monitoring and reporting the results. And so in terms of best practices, what works as a restoration measure and what not, in which conditions. Very important is also, especially towards the policymakers, to define the socio-economic benefits of all the investments in nature restoration. And finally, within those governance structure at national level, there is the need also to have financial support programs that are there, where site managers and private landowners can tap into. And we need to set up also a structure for stakeholder participation. So in the past, it was my feeling that research institutes and researchers often work rather separate from policymakers and from site managers. Not always, but in many cases, developing policies. It happens that we formulate an advice, and then it's up to the policymakers whether they take it up or not. And so I think it's, considering the short term we have for only 2 years to develop these national restoration plans, that we must do our best to do an effort to really closely work together, and so work with each other in one process instead of separate processes. Then we need to mirror this knowledge hub at national level as a proposition again to you all in a kind of European knowledge network hub, and so a coordination platform that needs to be established where we have all these thematic expert teams coming together, exchanging information on what they learned in their national national projects, and share the development of knowledge and detecting knowledge gaps, formulate demonstration projects, formulate standards of good practice. So the whole discussion behind that, organizing conferences, just mentioning the conferences that the society mentioned, organizes every second year, and where we meet with all the experts in restoration ecology to discuss some of these topics. The training and the Train the Trainers program, also an activity that is being done under the biogeographical process. We already have at European level several documentation platforms and search engines, but I'm sure this still can be improved. We need the monitoring and reporting needs to come together. That is a job for the European Environmental Agency and the European Topic Center for Biodiversity. And then there's the research agenda. I think what we see now is that calls for tender for research are really very, very broad often, and not so very specific. I think we could invest our money as science funding organizations better if we narrow down exactly to the specific questions that we need an answer for to do better restoration. And so really defining the research agenda could also be an advantage of having those European knowledge network hubs, and also for the support tools that are already there and can be improved as well. And then, of course, there is also the importance of financial support and stakeholder participation. Important is to know that we don't need to start from scratch here. At European level, we already have thematic working groups working on wetlands, working on grasslands, working on heathlands, and so on. It's a matter of better structuring and connecting all the people with the specific needs in mind for what we need to do to make this nature restoration law a success.
Chris, can you come to a conclusion, because we got only 5 minutes for questions?
Okay, I'm sorry. So my last slide is this. So we must realize that the nature restoration law is not approved yet, and that there are some bottlenecks there: loss of jobs, loss of food security, non-deterioration outside Natura 2000, rewetting of drained peatlands, especially outside Natura 2000, is a huge issue, and the Repower EU plan also poses conflicts. So my call to you all is, if you have in the short term scientific evidence or case studies demonstrating that restoration helps to maintain or enhance specifically these topics: job creation, food security, sustainable forestry, coexistence of restoration with wind and solar power plants, that these are very welcome to provide to me. I'm happy to collect them. If you have a statement, conclusion in English, can be a local report as well in a local language. If you provide the link, or, and that's something to be discussed, we can set up a task force maybe on these topics. And that's my end. And sorry for being over time.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. And a lot of appreciation is expressed with the emojis, Chris. Thank you. Okay, let's come to the final part of this webinar, to have some attention for the piling up of questions, but also remarks and additions. I see that Carolina tried already to answer some of the questions raised, but I give the floor now to Juliette to try to at least give you the opportunity to pose a question, or and Chris or Carolina or Jordi to answer the questions. I would suggest to Jordi, Carolina, and Chris that we look into the chat questions afterwards and try, if in any way possible, to answer them by email or whatever channels. Juliette, it's yours.
Well, thank you, Maurice. Thank you very much to all the speakers for your wonderful talks. And thank you to all that have posted questions and remarks, and also links to existing initiatives out there that I think obviously help a huge amount. So thank you very much. I had started compiling a list of questions, but we have very, very little time left. So I was just going to actually make the most of the last couple of minutes to ask Carolina maybe what your thoughts are on the national and EU hubs that were presented by Chris, and also what the next steps might be from a policy perspective to ensure that interlinkage that was shown between science practice and policy.
Yes, thank you, Juliette. Could you repeat the first part of the question? I got the one about the interlinkage.
Oh, around the well, your thoughts and also maybe next steps around the national and EU hubs ideas.
Oh, national and EU hubs. Yes. Well, it was the first time I saw this presented. I find this idea very interesting, and I think it is very promising actually to look into that. We are trying to, we have been trying for quite some time now to build something maybe less ambitious than was just presented through this EU biodiversity platform, where we have a specific subgroup on monitoring and assessment, but also as well through our knowledge center on biodiversity. Because there is a lot of knowledge, a lot of research going on, a lot of science, but it's not very easily translated into policy. So that link needs to be made a little bit better. So this knowledge center for biodiversity, it's a bit of an EU creation. So we have now combined all the sort of knowledge owning or managing parts of the Commission, so DG Research, the Joint Research Center, DG Environment, of course, Klima, but also the European Environment Agency into one group, which is a bit of a platform where we can share knowledge. Results of our research projects can feed into policies and vice versa. But for the nature restoration law specifically, I think we will really have to build something dedicated to each specific target in a way, because there will be a lot of knowledge gaps, sometimes not on the European but on the member state or local level that will need to be filled. If you look at reporting on on many of these indicators that we proposed, there are member states that are very advanced, but there are member states that have not even are practically just starting to do that job. So we really need to bring everyone to the same level playing field, and for that we will have to create some sort of administration. I don't want to talk about that too much. I don't think people have more appetite for administrative bodies, but without such coordination we will not manage. We have to bring everyone together to a certain extent. So all these really local knowledge on specific ecosystems, which will be very different from the north to the south, will somehow have to feed into the 20% restoration target by 2030, just to give you an example. It is a bit early to say how this will be done, because first we need to adopt the law. Once we have the law, then we will definitely set something up, so we will definitely hear from us. But for the time being, our main tool is the European Biodiversity Platform, the Monitoring and Assessment Group, which I think some of you are members of, and the Knowledge Center on Biodiversity, where we try to create this hub of science policy stakeholders.
Great, thank you very much, Carolina. It's very frustrating that we've run out of time.
I know there's a lot of questions, and I tried to answer, but then I was distracted by Chris's very interesting presentation.
I know. It's
But
fine.
I don't know if you will share the chat, or should I copy it? I don't know what's the best way
what
to.
we're going to do is we're going to compile everything that's in the chat into a short document that we will add to the Alternet website for the webinar, so that everything's there. And then maybe that can start a longer discussion as well with the commission and with the people here, but also those that haven't been able to join today, so that everything is at least in one place, and hopefully that will help people navigate through the next steps as well. So, great. So all that's left for me really is to thank everyone for making this webinar work today. So obviously the speakers, Chris, Carolina and Rodney, thank you very much. Also INBO for organizing the webinar with the support of SER-Europe, so thank you very much as well. Tessa and Tyler for the technical support, as ever amazing, and everyone that's attended. I saw that 190 people had attended the webinar, which is absolutely amazing, and obviously lots and lots of questions, lots of openings, lots of interesting ideas that have come out from today. The recording will be on the website, and I will compile everything, all the questions and answers there as well, so that we can look at that at your leisure. And also, just to finish, our next webinar on science policy interfaces will be in May. It'll be organized by the James Hutton Institute, and it will be on uncomfortable science policy relationships. How and how far is discomfort productive for enabling change towards sustainability? So we'll add that to the website soon, and obviously please register and continue with us on our journey on science policy interfaces. So thank you very much indeed. Maurice, I don't know whether you wanted to add a few last words? No?
Yeah, I think you are complete, Juliette. Thank you very much for this, and see you next time. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
And I'll now stop recording with your big smile, Juliette, as the finishing touch.
It was very